The rain drizzled softly over the city, casting a silvery veil over the bustling street below. Officer Daniel Carter sat in his patrol car, the glow of the dashboard lights reflecting in his tired eyes. The night had been uneventful so far, just the usual noise complaints and minor disturbances. He glanced at his watch. Midnight. Another quiet shift, or so it seemed. Then he noticed her. She appeared out of nowhere, standing at the corner of 8th and Monroe. A young black girl, no older than 8 or 9, barefoot and shivering in the rain. Her oversized hoodie hung limply over her small frame, wet fabric clinging to her like a second skin. Something about her presence sent a ripple of unease through Daniel. She wasn't crying, nor did she appear lost, yet there was a stillness to her that felt wrong. Daniel reached for his radio, but stopped short. The girl had locked eyes with him, her gaze piercing and unwavering. It wasn't the look of a child seeking help. It was something else entirely. Something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He stepped out of the car, the sound of his boots splashing against the wet pavement cutting through the silence. "Hey there, sweetheart," he called gently, keeping his voice calm and steady. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The girl didn't respond. Instead, she took a hesitant step forward, her small hands trembling as they clutched the hem of her hoodie. Daniel noticed her lips moving faintly, as if she were whispering to herself. He took a cautious step closer. "It's all right," he assured her, kneeling slightly to meet her eye level. "I'm Officer Carter. You can tell me what's wrong. Are you hurt? Is someone after you?" She stopped a few feet away from him, her dark eyes wide with a mix of fear and urgency. Finally she spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the single word she uttered hit Daniel like a bolt of lightning. "Run." For a split second he was frozen, his brain scrambling to process the word. Run? From what? Before he could ask, the girl lunged forward and grabbed his hand. Her tiny fingers were ice cold, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so small. Her eyes pleaded with him. And it was then that he noticed something else. Her pupils were dilated, and her breathing was shallow and ragged. "Wait, hold on," Daniel stammered, instinctively glancing around. The street was eerily empty, the usual hum of city life replaced by an oppressive silence. A sudden, sharp chill ran down his spine, as though the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in an instant. The girl tugged on his hand again, her voice grown more frantic. "You have to lock it down. Now." Daniel hesitated. Lock it down? The entire street? It didn't make sense. He was about to ask for clarification when he caught movement out of the corner of his eye. In the shadows of a nearby alley, something shifted. A figure, tall and unnaturally still, just barely visible through the haze of rain. His instincts kicked in. He grabbed his radio and called it in, his voice firm despite the growing sense of dread clawing at his chest. "This is Officer Carter requesting immediate backup at 8th and Monroe. Possible threat. Lock down the area. I repeat, lock down the area." The girl's grip tightened as she whispered again, this time so faintly he had to strain to hear her. "It's already here." Daniel turned to look at her, but her gaze wasn't on him. She was staring past him, her expression frozen in terror. Slowly, he followed her line of sight, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Daniel's eyes darted to where the girl was staring. At first, it was hard to make anything out through the rain, but then the figure emerged just enough from the shadows to be unmistakable. It stood unnervingly still, too far for Daniel to make out its face, but close enough for him to feel its presence like a weight pressing against his chest. It was tall, lanky, and wrong, its movements jerky, like a puppet with tangled strings. For every step it took forward, the air seemed to grow heavier, the rain quieter. Daniel's grip tightened around the girl's hand as he took a step back toward his car, his other hand instinctively hovering near his holster. "Stay close to me," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. The girl didn't respond. Her eyes remained fixed on the figure, unblinking, as if looking away would somehow make things worse. Daniel's training told him to call for more units, to gather intel, to assess the situation, but his instincts screamed something else. Get out of there. Now. Who's that? Daniel asked, his voice trembling despite his effort to sound calm. They're not supposed to be here, the girl said, her tone flat and devoid of the panic her expression conveyed. It followed me. Daniel's mind raced, trying to piece together what that meant. What do you mean it followed you? Who is it? Do you know them? She shook her head quickly, her hood slipping off to reveal thick, coiled hair plastered to her face by the rain. It's not someone, she said. It's something. The word hung in the air, sinking deep into Daniel's chest. He wanted to press her for more, but the figure shifted again, pulling his focus. It was moving now, slowly but deliberately, closing the distance between them. There was a strange fluidity to its movements, like it wasn't quite bound by the same laws of motion as everything else around them. The closer it got, the more oppressive the air became, like it was draining the life out of the street with every step. Daniel's training kicked in. Stay behind me, he said, his voice firmer this time. He reached for his radio again, but before he could say a word, the static cut through the frequency like nails on a chalkboard. He pulled the radio away from his ear, frowning at it. The static wasn't normal. It was erratic, almost rhythmic, as if it were mimicking speech in some distorted, nightmarish way. The girl's grip tightened on his hand, and she tugged him hard. You can't stop it, she said urgently. It's not here for you. It's here for me. What does that mean? Daniel asked, glancing down at her. Why is it here for you? What did you do? Her eyes finally broke from the figure, meeting his with a mixture of guilt and desperation. I ran. I didn't think it would find me, but it always does. Daniel didn't understand, but he could tell that pressing her for more would be useless. Whatever this was, it was beyond anything he'd encountered before, and his priority was getting her, and himself, out of danger. He backed up further toward his car, keeping the figure in his line of sight. As he reached for the door handle, a low, guttural sound rumbled through the air. It wasn't quite a growl, but it wasn't human either. Daniel froze, his hand hovering over the door. The sound seemed to come from everywhere, and nowhere all at once, vibrating in his chest like the echo of a distant explosion. The girl flinched, her body pressing against his leg, as though trying to merge into him for safety. It's too late, she whispered. It's already seen me. No, Daniel said firmly, pulling the door open and pushing her inside. We're getting out of here. Stay down and don't move. He slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, his hands trembling as he shifted into gear. The car's headlights illuminated the figure fully for the first time, and Daniel's stomach churned. It wasn't just the unnatural way it moved or the way its limbs seemed too long for its body. It was the face, or lack thereof. Where a face should have been, there was only smooth, pale skin, stretched tight like a canvas waiting to be painted. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if studying them. Then, without warning, it broke into a sprint. Daniel slammed on the gas, the tires screeching against the wet pavement as the car lurched forward. He glanced in the rearview mirror, his heart pounding as he saw the figure give chase. It was fast, unnaturally fast, faster than anything should be able to move on foot. Stay down, Daniel shouted to the girl, who had curled herself into a tight ball on the passenger seat. His mind raced as he sped through the empty streets, the figure gaining on them with every passing second. He needed a plan. He couldn't outrun it forever. Where are we going? The girl asked, her voice trembling. Somewhere safe, Daniel said, though he wasn't sure where that would be. Every fibre of his being told him this wasn't something he could handle alone. He needed backup, reinforcements, someone who could make sense of this nightmare. But as he glanced at the radio, still emitting its eerie, distorted static, he knew that help wasn't coming. Not tonight. The car swerved sharply as Daniel took a corner too fast, the rear tires skidding before finding traction again. The figure was still behind them, its movements almost mechanical as it closed the gap. Daniel gritted his teeth, his knuckles white, as he gripped the steering wheel. He couldn't let it catch them. He wouldn't. Suddenly, the girl sat up slightly, her eyes wide. "Turn left," she said urgently. "What? Why?" Daniel demanded, glancing at her. "Just do it," she cried. "It won't follow us there." Against his better judgment, Daniel veered left, the car jolting as it hit a pothole. The street they turned onto was narrower, lined with abandoned buildings that loomed like silent sentinels in the dark. Daniel glanced in the rearview mirror again, and his heart skipped a beat. The figure had stopped at the corner, its head tilted as it watched them disappear down the street. It made no move to follow, standing eerily still as the rain continued to fall around it. Daniel slowed the car, his breathing heavy as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. "Why did it stop?" he asked, turning to the girl. "What's down here?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked out the window, her expression unreadable. "It doesn't like this place," she said quietly. "Nothing does." "What are you talking about?" Daniel pressed. "What's going on?" "I need answers." The girl turned to him, her eyes filled with a sadness far beyond her years. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." "Try me," Daniel said, his voice firm. She hesitated, then finally spoke. "It's not just a thing that follows people. It's a collector. And once it's marked you, there's no escaping it. You can only run." Her words sent a chill down Daniel's spine. Before he could respond, a loud metallic groan echoed through the street, reverberating off the crumbling buildings around them. Both Daniel and the girl froze, their eyes darting to the shadows ahead. Whatever had kept the figure at bay wasn't going to protect them for long. The metallic groan reverberated through the street again, louder this time, as if the very foundation of the city was bending to the will of whatever force had set its sights on them. Daniel's heart raced, his hands trembling on the steering wheel as he scanned the darkened alley ahead. The girl's words echoed in his mind. "It's a collector. A collector of what? Souls? Memories?" He didn't know, but he had the feeling that finding out wasn't going to be a pleasant experience. The street was empty now, the shadows deep and impenetrable. Abandoned cars lined the curb, their windows fogged with condensation, their doors slightly ajar as if they had been left in a hurry. The smell of dampness and decay hung in the air, adding to the sense of unease that gnawed at Daniel's insides. He glanced at the rearview mirror again. Nothing. But that didn't mean they were safe. Not by a long shot. "What is this place?" he asked, trying to steady his breath. "Where are we?" The girl didn't respond immediately, her eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. It was almost as if she was weighing something in her mind, deciding whether to share more of the truth with him. Finally, she turned to him, her face pale in the dim light of the dashboard. "This is where it comes from," she said quietly. "It's not just after me. It's after everyone who's ever been marked by the things that live in this place. It feeds on us, takes what it wants, and leaves nothing but emptiness behind." Daniel's mind raced as he tried to process her words. Mark it. He glanced at her again, wondering if he was missing something crucial. Was she in some kind of danger because of something she had done, something she had touched? He had no way of knowing, and right now, he didn't have the time to ask. "You said it doesn't like this place," he said, trying to find something to hold on to. "If we stay here, we'll be safe." The girl shook her head slowly. "It doesn't like it here, but that doesn't mean it can't come. It can't be stopped. Not like that." Daniel exhaled sharply, frustration mounting. He wanted to understand, but the more he heard, the less sense it all made, and the more the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Whatever was out there, whatever it was closing in on them. He checked the mirrors again. Still nothing. But that didn't mean the danger wasn't lurking. "We need to move. Now." Before the words could even leave his mouth, a shadow flickered at the edge of the street. Then another. They were moving fast, darting between the crumbling buildings, too quick for him to catch sight of them fully. And they weren't alone. He slammed his foot on the gas, but the car sputtered, lurching forward with a violent shake before stalling. Panic surged through him as he turned the key, but the engine refused to start. His pulse quickened. "What's happening?" he muttered, frantically twisting the key again. The girl didn't speak, but her eyes were wide with fear now. She didn't need to say anything. Her body language said it all. They were trapped. The shadows were closing in, circling around them, and Daniel could feel the pressure building in the air, like an unseen hand was tightening around his throat. Something was coming, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep it at bay. Suddenly, the car jerked forward, a harsh grinding sound coming from beneath them, as though the ground itself was shifting. Daniel slammed on the brakes, his heart racing as the car came to a screeching halt, just inches from the edge of a deep, dark pit that had opened up in the street. The asphalt had split open, and a thick, black mist was spilling out from the crevice, swirling in a slow, deliberate motion. The girl's breath caught in her throat as she pressed herself against the passenger door. "It's here," she whispered, her voice trembling. Daniel's eyes locked on the pit. It was impossible to see the bottom, the darkness so deep that it felt like it went on forever. He could feel a pull, an unnatural gravity drawing him toward it. The air smelled of rot and decay, and he knew instinctively that whatever was inside wasn't something that could be reasoned with. He had to get them out of there. "Come on," he muttered, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles. He tried the ignition again, but the engine only sputtered in response. The air inside the car was growing colder, the chill creeping into his bones. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the freezing temperature. The girl's hand shot out, grabbing his wrist. "We have to leave," she said, her voice pleading. "It's too late." The words sent a jolt of terror through Daniel. "Too late? For what?" He turned to her, eyes wide. "What do you mean, it's too late?" The ground beneath them shook suddenly, the pit widening as if it were alive, a gaping mouth waiting to swallow them whole. And then he saw it. At first, it was just a flicker in the dark, a shape moving in the swirling mist. Then, as it stepped into the light of the car's headlights, Daniel's blood froze in his veins. It wasn't the same figure he had seen earlier. This was something far worse. It was massive, towering over the pit, its limbs long and unnaturally bent, its body like a twisted silhouette made of smoke and shadow. Its face, if it could even be called that, was nothing more than a smooth, featureless surface. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, as though it was savoring the moment before it struck. The girl's grip tightened around his wrist, her voice shaking as she whispered, "It's the one that collects." Daniel's mind raced. The figure wasn't just another one of the creatures chasing them. It was the one. The collector. He had no idea what it wanted, but he could feel the overwhelming sense of danger that radiated from it. This was no longer about escape. This was about survival. He could hear the mist swirling, feel the pressure building around them. The air was thick with a stifling, oppressive energy, and Daniel knew with a chilling certainty that the collector wasn't going to let them go. It was never going to let them go. The girl whispered again, her voice barely audible above the deafening silence. "You shouldn't have come here." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" But before she could answer, the mist began to coalesce, the shadowed figure shifting forward with a terrifying speed. Time was running out. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest, the cold sweat dripping down his back. The figure, the collector, was moving closer, its form shifting and writhing, as though it were made of smoke, an ever-changing mass of darkness that seemed to absorb the very light around it. Every instinct in Daniel's body screamed at him to run, to get out, but he was frozen in place, his hands trembling on the steering wheel, his mind racing for a way to escape. The girl beside him had gone eerily still. Her eyes were wide with terror, but there was something else there too, resignation, as if she had known all along that this moment would come. The car's engine sputtered again, useless, and the pit beneath them seemed to grow deeper, the black mist swelling faster, pulling them in. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as he turned to her, his voice frantic. "Tell me what we can do. Please, tell me how we stop it. We can't just sit here." The girl shook her head slowly, her voice small but steady. "You can't stop it, officer. It's not something you can fight. You can't kill it. You can only outrun it, hide from it, but it always finds you. It always comes back. Daniel's mind raced. He couldn't just accept that. He wouldn't. He couldn't let this thing claim another life. Not after everything that had happened. He slammed his fist on the dashboard, frustration boiling over. There has to be something. Anything. But the girl didn't respond. She didn't need to. The collector was getting closer, its eerie form gliding effortlessly toward them, as if it were moving through water, seamless and without effort. It was impossibly tall, its limbs unnaturally long, reaching out like dark tendrils that threatened to wrap around everything in their path. The mist was thickening, and the oppressive weight of it made it feel like they were trapped in some kind of nightmare. Daniel's breath came in short, panicked gasps. He couldn't stay here, not like this. If he didn't move, if he didn't do something, he was going to lose everything. The feeling of suffocation, of impending doom, pressed against his chest, making it harder and harder to think clearly. The girl's voice broke through the haze of panic. "It knows where we are," she whispered, her tone so soft it barely registered. "It always knows." Daniel turned to look at her, his mind desperately trying to grasp her words. "What do you mean? How does it know?" "It can smell fear," she replied, her eyes distant as though she were seeing something far beyond the present. "It can feel it, track it. The more afraid you are, the more it knows. That's how it finds you." Daniel felt the blood drain from his face. His fear, it was feeding it. Every minute he spent frozen in terror, the collector was getting closer, honing in on him, drawn to his every heartbeat. He clenched his fists, trying to push the fear down, but it was impossible. His body was trembling, his heart was hammering against his chest, and there was nowhere to run. He had no choice but to face it. But then, just as the figure was about to reach them, a strange sensation rippled through the air, a sudden shift, like the world itself had taken a breath. The mist stopped swirling, and the dark figure froze mid-step. Daniel blinked, confused, his pulse racing even faster. The girl's eyes widened. It can't get us here," she said, barely able to believe the words herself. "Not with the mark." Daniel turned sharply to her, his confusion growing. "What do you mean the mark? What mark?" Her voice was barely above a whisper as she reached up to pull the sleeve of her wet hoodie back, revealing a strange symbol etched into the skin of her wrist. It was dark, almost black, and had a swirling, intricate pattern that seemed to pulse with a faint, unnatural light. "I was marked the first time it came for me," she explained, her voice shaking. It didn't take me, but it left this mark. And now it knows me. It always knows me." Daniel stared at the mark, his mind racing to understand what it meant. The collector had followed her, drawn to her, because of this mark. But it hadn't taken her. Why? Why hadn't it claimed her the first time? Before he could ask, the air shifted again, and the collector moved. It was no longer gliding. It was charging toward them, its form becoming more defined, its features less blurred. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was something solid, something real, and it was coming for them. The mist was thick now, swirling around their car as if trying to suffocate them. Daniel's pulse thundered in his ears, drowning out everything else. "Get out of the car." The girl screamed suddenly, her eyes wild with fear. "Get out. It's too late to hide in here." Daniel's hands shot out, grabbing for the door handle, but his fingers were slick with sweat, making it hard to grip. He yanked the door open, just as the collector's tendrils reached out, slashing the air with an unnatural sound like 1,000 nails scraping against glass. His heart was in his throat, every instinct telling him to run, to get far, far away from whatever was happening. But there was nowhere to go. The girl was already out of the car, her feet hitting the wet pavement as she turned to look back at him. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with the same fear that gripped him. "You can't outrun it, Daniel," she screamed, her voice barely audible over the rising wind. "We have to stop it. We have to fight." The collector's tendrils lashed out, but they didn't strike. Instead, they seemed to hesitate, as though testing the air, feeling for something. Daniel's breath came in ragged gasps as he scanned the street, desperate for an answer, something, anything to give him a chance to survive this nightmare. But before he could think, the girl turned back to him, her eyes filled with a new kind of resolve. She grabbed his arm, her grip firm, despite her shaking hands. "It's not just after me. It's after all of us. Everyone it's marked," she said. "And if we don't do something now, if we don't face it, we'll never get another chance." The words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about them anymore. This was bigger, much bigger. The collector was closing in, and whatever power it had, whatever dark force was behind it, was growing stronger. And now, in this moment, there was only one thing left to do: fight.